In some sense, you could say all of engineering is about design. I mean, engineering is based on the idea that we have a goal of something we want to accomplish, and then we find ways to do that. And so engineering is explicitly a design paradigm. So, you know, you might think that that wouldn't work too well with biology if you think it's unplanned and blind and so on. Yet they're finding that actually a lot of the engineering paradigms work extremely well. So essentially they're getting to the point where they're saying, let's adopt the fiction of assuming that this is designed by a master engineer, and then think like an engineer of how to reverse engineer this. And they're finding that actually it leads to quantitative predictions for good biology. You know, for social reasons, basically. Yeah, I think that, well, I guess I would say two things. One is just inertia, that is the prevailing, you know, paradigm, is the blind watchmaker, you know, the secular atheist paradigm. People don't want to question. But I guess I would also say, as I talked about in my talk, there's some people who have a genuine fear that if you allow God in the language at all, if you even open a crack in the door, we'll just return to medieval superstition. And that, you know, so they will talk about people being anti-science by bringing in God. And I think there are some people who genuinely fear that we'll be, you know, going back to burning witches and, you know, and seeing portents and goose on trails and so on, you know, because, you know, that has been done, right? You know, that's what science grew out of, that superstitious background. And as I talked about in my talk, it was Christians who threw that out. It wasn't secular atheists. It was Reformed Christians who said we need to get rid of superstition and be sensible about the way we think about things. So the high value on truth and not just believing everything you hear was very much a Christian instinct that you know, drove both the Reformation and the scientific revolution. But I would say that, you know, so some people, like I said, would be just reactionary against changing the paradigm, but I think other people, rightly or wrongly, fear that, you know, letting Christianity or theism in the door will just take us right back to the Dark Ages, and that's kind of, they believe that. You could sort of think of there's two domains, okay, science and religion. I don't believe they're non-overlapping. I think that they have a lot of overlap, but let's treat them separately for the moment. You could say within science, you can say science critiques other science. So you have one scientist who would say, you know, I critique your scientific results. In the same way, within the religious sphere, religious people critique other religions. And even within Christianity, you have schools of thought, of theology that critique each other and say, well, you're just doing it wrong, and here's the argument, and so on. People generally tend to be comfortable with those kind of internal critiques. But if you believe there's one world, it's a unified world, and we're in the job of pursuing truth, then I think we need to allow for cross-disciplinary critique, so to speak, and people tend to be very uncomfortable with one or the other of these. So on the one hand, I would say allowing your science to critique your religion and to adjust your biblical interpretation based on scientific results, such as we heard about this morning with old earth creationism, that makes some people very, very uncomfortable. On the other hand, it makes theistic evolutionists very happy. To say, you know, whatever the science says, we're just going to adopt that and we'll adjust our religion to accommodate it. Conversely, I would say allowing religion to critique science, and so to say, well, I believe there's a single Adam and Eve on the basis of my religious texts, makes other people very uncomfortable and makes young earth creationists very happy. You know? And actually what I'm arguing for is both directions, to say that sometimes a very good scientific argument comes along that does force you to say, well, maybe I've been misinterpreting these scriptures. And sometimes a very good religious argument comes along to say, maybe I've been misinterpreting the scientific data. Sometimes you're just left with tension of saying, well, I can't really resolve, you know, who has the upper hand here. But I would say all four types of critique, sort of an internal critique within science, internal within religion, and each critiquing the other, should be part of what we do if we're seeking truth. Certainly in terms of me being a believer, it's very collegial. I've never had somebody, at least, you know, to my face, attack me for being a Christian. Maybe people say things behind my back, but it hasn't hindered my science at all. And actually I've had a lot of great conversations with people over a beer at a conference and so on, talking about beliefs. And Most scientists that I've talked with are somewhere on the religious spectrum, whether being a deist, sort of Einstein's, absentee God, versus people who believe in God but don't go to church, and the whole spectrum. So at a personal level, I haven't really seen that to be a problem. Yeah, I mean, I think that in some sense it hasn't been as critical an issue for me because it's not my day job, so to speak. So I've published a couple things on numerical biology, and some people say, well, I don't really buy that. But on the other hand, when I've sat down and talked with people in biophysics and laid out like what I did, I've had good conversations. They're like, well, that seems like a reasonable model. That's an interesting catch-22. I'll have to think about that one. So honestly, you never know how the winds politically may change, but to this date, I haven't felt a huge amount of pushback. And part of it is just because it isn't my main area of activity. Yeah, it's interesting. So I became a Christian at the end of high school. And at that time, I would have been very comfortable with theistic evolution and read things and had no sort of reason not to be a theistic evolutionist. I went to undergrad at Cornell, and actually, while I was there, took a course in biophysics, audited a course by I believe he was a conservative Jewish professor. And he just walked us through all of the amazing design of life. And, there was no sort of theological language, and yet there was just sort of the awestruck tones of how the fine-tuning of tunneling rates and things like that had to be just right or life would be impossible. I remember him talking about the respiration, the fact that we can breathe air, depends on exponentially sensitive tunneling rates. So quantum tunneling is an exponentially sensitive process. So if you go a little bit too low, it's completely shut off, and you don't have any respiration. A little bit too high, and you burn up like a torch. And it's got to be just exactly right. And of course, fine-tuning, which we now see all over the place in biology, says right at that critical point. And so that really got me thinking. But I remember reading in graduate school a bunch of books that were coming out not by Christians. I remember one by a person named Louise Young, who is a popular science writer, talking about the design of nature and so on. But the thing that probably was the tipping point for me was I believe I was either just about to graduate or I had already graduated and was over in Germany, but I read a Scientific American article, and it was assessing all the different origin of life theories. This is like 1990, I believe, was when this came out. And they basically looked at one or the other and discarded each, saying, well, this has been disproven, the Uri experiments and all these things, we thought this was the way, and that, it was a very honest look. And then at the end of the article, they're saying, well, what's left? All these have been discredited, and they say, well, really the only viable theory that's left is that aliens from outer space, brought life down. And I just about threw it across the room, and I'm like, you know what? I am no longer embarrassed of anything that I believe. If that's the best that they can do, that space aliens came down, then I'm pretty open to lots of alternatives, because that one is crackpot. And yet it's being presented. And since then, people talk, Richard Dawkins embracing this and so on. There are serious people saying that the problem is so difficult, it must have been aliens from outer space that brought it down. And I'm like, if that's the best you can do, then it's just like giving up. Yeah, I would basically say teach evolution and teach the critiques of it. And it's funny because many people will say, well, it's a religious critique and that should go in the religion class and so on. And that may be also something you want to do in a religious sociology class or something. But I would say there is a myth of science that is out there that people would say, unless you have a viable, alternative, deterministic scientific program to replace one with, then you have no valid critique. And that's absolutely not the way science works. A lot of times in science, somebody proposes a theory and they say, this is the explanation for this. And somebody simply shoots it down and says, that won't work. I don't have a rival theory. I don't have anything to replace it with, but I know that one's wrong. Happens to me all the time. It's not my job to tell you what the replacement of your theory is. You're telling me a theory, and I'm telling you it won't work. And so, the idea that people would say there is no critique of evolution other than religion. That's simply not true. There's a lot of scientific critique. So I'd be very comfortable with saying teach a theory of evolution so people know what it is, and then teach scientific critiques of it. In some sense, it leaves a question unanswered, which is, well, what is the alternative? I'm okay with invoking miracles at certain points, but I don't think that I would teach those in the science class. I would leave that to the religion class. But I would say, teaching in the science class that our explanations simply break down at this point or other, and saying maybe in the distant future or the near future somebody will come up with some deterministic way to explain that, but at the moment we don't have any, and be happy with that. Well, the website is christianscientific.org. And we have 2 levels of membership. So to be a full member, you have to actually be a scientist, and you have to actually be a Christian and subscribe to a statement of faith. But anybody who wants to can also just sign up to pay the dues and get the newsletters and go to the meetings and so on. Yeah, we definitely encourage anybody interested in these issues to go to our website, sign up, and to come to our meetings if they're near where they live. Yeah, so I have several scientific books, which would be boring to most people. Although I have a textbook in electronics, which some people might find accessible. But I have one book it's really a theological book. It's called A Biblical Case for an Old Earth. And somewhat along the lines of what we heard this morning, but it has one chapter on science. But in my opinion, the arguments that young Earth creationists are primarily making are theological ones. They're saying, if old Earth creation is true, that means animals died before Adam and Eve lived, and a lot of other sort of theological, philosophical objections. And so the book is primarily one big Bible study.